It's a funny thing, memory. Sometimes it plays tricks on you, blurring the edges of a face you thought you'd never forget. Other times it's a dagger, so sharp and clear, it feels like it happened just this morning. For me, the sharpest memory of all isn't my wedding day, or even the day my son was born. It's the day I stood in my silent kitchen staring at a single, glossy photograph of a seashell, a simple, spiral conch shell. To anyone else, it was just a picture. To me, it was the first thread I pulled that unraveled my entire world. My name is Margaret Miller. I'm 72 years old, and for 45 of those years, I was married to the finest man God ever put on this earth, Arthur Miller. Arthur wasn't a man of grand gestures. He showed his love in the foundations of things. He built the bookshelves in the living room with his own 2 hands. He planted the old oak tree in the front yard the day our son, Robert, was born. And he bought this house, this sturdy brick colonial in a quiet corner of Somerville, not as an investment, but as a promise. "A home is a fortress, Maggie," he used to say, his voice a low rumble. "It's where the family is safe." Arthur passed away 5 years ago, and the silence he left behind was deafening. But I had my fortress. I had my memories, and I had my son, Robert. My Robert. He was always a good boy, a bit of a dreamer, with a heart 2 sizes too big for his own chest. He felt things deeply, which made him kind, but also terribly easy to lead. And the person leading him for the last 10 years was his wife, Isabella. Isabella. When Robert first brought her home, I admit, I was charmed. She was beautiful, in that sharp, modern way. All angles and bright, confident smiles. She dripped compliments like honey. "Oh, Margaret, this roast is divine. You must give me the recipe, though I could never make it as well as you. Robert is so lucky to have a mother like you, so wise and grounded." It was all very lovely. Arthur, however, was less convinced. He'd sit in his favourite worn leather armchair after she'd left, swirling the ice in his glass, a thoughtful frown on his face. "There's a difference, Maggie," he told me one night, "between a bell that rings true and one that's just polished brass." I'd hushed him, told him he was being cynical. It's one of my life's great regrets. The beginning of the end came on a sunny Tuesday in May. Robert and Isabella had invited me over to their house for lunch, a tidy little Cape Cod on the other side of town. I remember thinking how bare the walls looked as I walked in. The family photos were gone. The little knickknacks they'd collected had vanished. Isabella met me at the door, her smile a little too wide, a little too bright. "Mum, so good you could make it," she chirped, kissing the air beside my cheek. Her perfume was expensive and overpowering. Robert came out of the kitchen wringing his hands. He couldn't meet my eye. That was the first alarm bell. My son could never lie to me without his gaze skittering away like a nervous bird. "Mum," he started, his voice strained, "we have some exciting news." Isabella took over, her voice smooth as silk. "Robert and I have decided to embark on a new chapter, Margaret. A real adventure. I'm finally launching my own business." I smiled. "That's wonderful, dear. What kind of business?" "It's a luxury lifestyle and wellness brand," she explained, gesturing vaguely with her perfectly manicured hands. "Curated experiences, bespoke products. It's about empowering people to live their most authentic, beautiful lives. It's called Elysian Aura." It sounded like a whole lot of nonsense to me, but I kept my smile in place. "Well, that sounds ambitious." "It is," she beamed. "And an ambitious project requires capital. Significant capital." That's when Robert finally looked at me, his eyes pleading. "Mum, we've sold the house." The words hung in the air, thick and heavy. I looked around the empty room, and it all clicked into place. The missing pictures, the sterile feel. It wasn't a home anymore. It was a shell. You sold your house, I said, my voice barely a whisper. It was the only way, Robert said quickly, to fund Isabella's dream. All the equity we built up, it's going to be the seed money. I did the math in my head. They'd bought the house for $250,000 10 years ago. The market had been kind. Robert, how much did you... Isabella answered for him, her tone breezy, as if she were discussing the weather. The final sale price was $710,000. After the mortgage and fees, we cleared just over $620,000. $620,000. The number felt obscene. It was a lifetime of careful saving, of mortgage payments, of painting walls and fixing leaky faucets. It was their future. And you've given that money to Isabella? I asked, my voice flat. Invested, Margaret. Invested in our future. She corrected me gently, placing a hand on Robert's arm. Once Elysian aura takes off, this will look like pocket change. Robert nodded enthusiastically, a puppet on her string. Exactly, Mum. You have to see the business plan. It's incredible. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. I knew my son. He wouldn't know a business plan from a grocery list, but there was another shoe waiting to drop. I could feel it. So, I said, trying to keep my voice steady, where will you be living while you build this empire? Isabella's smile was positively dazzling. Well, that's the other part of our wonderful news. We were hoping we could stay with you for a little while, just until the business is on its feet. 6 months, maybe a year at most. It'll be fun, like a big family slumber party. And there it was. They had sold their fortress, given the gold to her, and now they were coming for mine. My safe harbour. Arthur's promise. What could I say? He was my only child. His face was a mask of desperate hope. To say no would be to declare war, to sever the last real connection I had in the world, against every screaming instinct in my body, against the ghost of Arthur whispering, "I told you so," in my ear. I heard myself say the word that would seal my fate. Of course. They moved in 2 weeks later, not with a few suitcases, but with a moving truck. My quiet, orderly home was suddenly flooded with their things. Boxes labelled Isabella's closet took over the guest room. Robert's old bedroom became a storage unit for her product prototypes. Scented candles that smelled like chemicals and bath salts in fancy jars. The first month was a study in passive aggression. Isabella, who had once praised my cooking, now wrinkled her nose at my pot roast. "Oh, Margaret, that's so heavy. I'm trying to keep my palate clean for the brand. I'll just whip up a kale and quinoa salad." My home-cooked meals were replaced by the smell of burnt kale and the constant whir of her expensive blender. She began to update the house. A sleek white minimalist coffee table replaced the sturdy oak one Arthur had made. "It just opens up the space so much, don't you think?" she'd say, not waiting for an answer. One afternoon I came downstairs to find Arthur's beloved leather armchair, the one he'd sat in every night, the one that still held the faint scent of his pipe tobacco and the shape of his body, had been moved to the basement. "It was just so dark and bulky. It was throwing off the whole vibe," she explained, pointing to a spindly, uncomfortable-looking thing in its place. "This is much more Elysian aura." I felt a rage so pure and hot it nearly choked me. I said nothing. I just went down to the dark, damp basement, sat in Arthur's chair, and cried. Robert, when I tried to talk to him, just sighed. "Mum, please try to get along. Isabella is under a lot of pressure. The launch is a huge deal." The launch. It was all we heard about. Isabella didn't work in an office. She worked from my living room, dressed in designer athleisure wear, taking endless calls on her speakerphone. The calls were filled with buzzwords like synergy, monetization, and brand activation. She was constantly ordering things online. Boxes arrived daily from high-end department stores, new clothes, new shoes, a $3,000 handbag she called essential for networking. "It's all about image, Margaret," she'd tell me, as if I were a child. "You have to spend money to make money." Except I never saw any money being made. I saw the $620,000 bleeding away. A brand new luxury SUV appeared in the driveway. "It's a company car," she announced. She hosted strategy lunches for her influencer friends at the most expensive restaurants in town, posting dozens of photos on social media. The photos were always of perfectly arranged plates of food, champagne glasses, and smiling, vacant faces. Robert became her chauffeur and her assistant. He'd ferry her to the salon, to her yoga classes, to her meetings that never seemed to result in anything tangible. He looked tired, his shoulders slumped. The light in his eyes was gone, replaced by a permanent, worried squint. He was losing weight. I tried to talk to him again one evening when Isabella was out at a networking gala. I'd made his favourite, a simple shepherd's pie. He picked at it listlessly. "Robert, honey, are you okay?" "I'm fine, Mum, just busy." "This business, is it going well? Are you seeing any returns on your investment?" He flinched at the word. "These things take time. Isabella says we're building a foundation." "The foundation of this house is built on brick and mortar, Robert," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "The foundation of your future was in your house, your equity. It's gone. What happens when the money runs out?" He threw his fork down. "Why can't you ever be supportive? You've had it in for Isabella since day one. You're just jealous that she's a modern woman with ambition, not just a housewife." The word hung between us, uglier than any curse. A housewife. As if the 45 years I'd spent building a loving home, raising him, supporting his father, meant nothing. As if my life's work was a trifle. "I'm going to bed," he muttered, pushing his chair back and leaving the barely touched pie on the table. That was the night I stopped being a victim and started being a detective. Arthur always said, "If something doesn't add up, it's because you don't have all the numbers." I needed the numbers. My chance came a week later. Isabella was in the shower, her ridiculously expensive handbag left on the kitchen counter. I'd never stooped to something like this in my life, but the woman who called me a housewife had forfeited her right to my respect. My hands trembled as I opened the clasp. Inside, amongst the designer wallet and lipstick, was a stack of receipts and a bank statement she'd carelessly shoved in. I took them to my room and spread them out on the bed. My blood ran cold. The receipts were a litany of excess. $800 for a pair of shoes, $1,200 for a spa day, $500 for a dinner, for two. But it was the bank statement that made me gasp. It was from a different bank than their usual one. The account was in Isabella's name only. There had been one massive deposit 3 months ago, $620,000. The current balance was $97,416. She had burned through more than $500,000 in 90 days. But that wasn't the worst of it. I saw regular monthly payments, thousands of dollars each, going to something called Prestige Holdings LLC. And there were several large withdrawals, tens of thousands of dollars, marked simply as wire transfer. This wasn't business spending. This was something else. This is where the seashell comes in. Tucked into the bank statement was a glossy photo, the kind you get from a photo lab. It was a close-up of a beautiful conch shell on a white sand beach. The back was blank. It seemed completely random, but Isabella was not a random person. Everything she did had a purpose. I put the photo aside, my mind racing. Prestige Holdings, wire transfers, a seashell. It felt like a puzzle I couldn't solve. I needed help. I called David Perkins, an old friend of Arthur's. David was a retired forensic accountant, a man who could make numbers sing and confess their darkest secrets. I met him for coffee, laying out the whole sordid story. He listened patiently, his brow furrowed. "Maggie, this stinks to high heaven," he said, tapping the copy of the bank statement I'd made. "Elysian Aura is a sham. It's a classic bleed out. She's created a narrative that justifies extravagant spending, and your son is footing the bill for her high life." "But what is Prestige Holdings and the wire transfers?" "Let me do some digging," he said. "Corporate records, public filings. If this LLC is registered, I'll find it." While David worked his magic, I did some digging of my own. I started with the picture of the seashell. On a hunch, I went onto Isabella's social media, something I rarely did. I scrolled back for months, through endless pictures of fancy cocktails and yoga poses, and then I found it. A post from 6 months ago, before they sold the house. It was a picture of her and a man I'd never seen before. He was handsome, with a slick salesman's smile. They were on a tropical beach. The caption read, "Missing the Cayman Islands and my favorite travel buddy, Julian. Can't wait for our next adventure. #Wanderlust, #Island Life." In the corner of the picture, on the sand next to her, was a large, perfect conch shell, the same shell from the photograph. My heart was hammering against my ribs. Julian. I searched for his name, linked to hers. It didn't take long to find him. Julian Croft. His profile was all pictures of him on yachts, in front of sports cars, always in exotic locations. He was a real estate developer specializing in offshore opportunities. When David called me 2 days later, his voice was grim. "Maggie, I found it. Prestige Holdings LLC is a shell corporation registered in the Cayman Islands. It's a ghost, but I traced the director's name. It's a man named Julian Croft." The puzzle pieces slammed into place with sickening force. "And the wire transfers?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "They went to an offshore account, also in the Caymans, also linked to Croft. This wasn't just frivolous spending. This was a long con. Isabella wasn't building a business. She was siphoning Robert's future into an offshore account with her partner, this Julian. The seashell photo wasn't a memory. It was a promise. A symbol of the paradise they were stealing to go live in. I felt a strange calm settle over me. The grief and the anger solidified into a cold, hard resolve. They had mistaken my kindness for weakness. They had desecrated my home and my husband's memory. They had tried to turn my son against me and steal his life. Isabella hadn't just made a bad investment. She had committed calculated, malicious fraud, and I was going to burn her empire to the ground. But how? If I confronted Robert, he'd just defend her. She would lie, manipulate, and turn it all around on me. I needed something undeniable. Something that would shatter Robert's delusion so completely he could never piece it back together. I needed a cannon, not a slingshot. And then I remembered Arthur. My wise, practical Arthur. He had always been 3 steps ahead of everyone else. I went to the old roll-top desk in his study, a place I hadn't touched since he died. I opened the bottom drawer and pulled out the thick file folder marked Last Will and Testament and Estate Documents. I had read the will, of course. It was simple. Everything went to me, and upon my death, it was to be divided equally for any of my surviving children. But underneath the will was a separate, sealed envelope. On the front, in Arthur's neat, strong handwriting, it said, "For Margaret," to be opened only in case of dire family circumstances threatening the disposition of the marital home. My hands shook as I broke the wax seal. Inside was a legal document, a trust addendum, and a letter. I read the letter first. "My dearest Maggie, if you are reading this, it means my fears have come to pass. I hope they never do. But a man must plan for storms, not just for sunny days. I love our son, but I see his weakness. He leads with his heart, and I fear someone will one day take advantage of that good heart and lead him to ruin. I have always had a deep unease about Isabella. I see an avarice in her eyes that chills me. She doesn't love Robert. She loves what Robert can provide. I could not forbid the marriage, but I can protect you. I can protect the fortress. Enclosed is a legally binding addendum to our family trust, drafted by our lawyer, Mr. Henderson. I have termed it the Prodigal Son Clause. It is very specific. It states that if any direct heir, namely Robert, cohabitates in our home after willfully liquidating their own primary residence and transferring the majority of those assets to a third party without a secured, formal business contract, thereby rendering themselves financially dependent, then two things are triggered immediately. First, the deed of our house automatically transfers into an irrevocable trust, with you as the lifetime beneficiary, but with our lawyer as the sole trustee. This means you can live here forever, but you cannot sell it, and no one can force you to. It protects the home from any potential future debts or claims incurred by its occupants. Second, it activates a discretionary fund I set aside, which the trustee can use for your legal protection and to forcibly remove any financially parasitic occupants from the premises. He will need proof, Maggie. Proof of the house sale, the asset transfer, and the financial dependency. It sounds like you have found it. Call Mr. Henderson. This is my last gift to you. My final way of keeping you safe in our fortress. All my love. Forever, Arthur. I sat there, clutching the letter, tears streaming down my face. Tears of grief for the man I missed so terribly, and tears of gratitude for his incredible, unwavering love and foresight. He had seen it all. From his armchair in the living room, he had seen the future and had built one last, indestructible wall around me. The time for quiet suffering was over. It was time for the slumber party to end. I called Mr. Henderson the next morning. I laid out everything: the house sale, the $620,000, Isabella's spending, the offshore accounts, Julian Croft, and finally, Arthur's letter. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "My God," Mr. Henderson finally said, his voice thick with emotion. "Arthur Miller. That man was a chess player in a world of checkers. Margaret, you have everything you need. Let's set the board." The plan was simple and devastatingly theatrical. Mr. Henderson scheduled a mandatory estate planning review at his office for the following Tuesday. I told Robert and Isabella that since they were living with me, it was important they understood the details of my will, so there were no surprises later. Isabella's eyes lit up, no doubt imagining how soon she could get her hands on the rest of the family money. We sat in Mr. Henderson's plush boardroom. Me, a nervous but resolute old woman. Robert, looking bewildered. And Isabella, looking smug, tapping her diamond-encrusted nails on the polished mahogany table. Mr. Henderson began with pleasantries before getting to the point. "As you know, we're here to review Margaret's estate. But before we look forward, we need to address a present-day clause in the existing Miller family trust." Arthur Miller was a very thorough man. He slid a copy of the Prodigal Son Clause across the table to Robert and Isabella. I watched her face as she read it. The smug smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of confusion, then dawning horror. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice sharp. "This is ridiculous." "It is, I assure you, a fully executed and legally binding trust addendum," Mr. Henderson said calmly. He then proceeded, with the dispassionate precision of a surgeon, to lay out the evidence. A certified copy of the deed of sale for their house. A bank confirmation of the $620,000 transfer into Isabella's sole account. A detailed summary, provided by David Perkins, of her spending over the last 3 months, showing the dissipation of over $520,000. And finally, printouts of the wire transfers to Prestige Holdings, LLC, with a cover page detailing its registration to Mr. Julian Croft in the Cayman Islands. He slid the photo of the seashell into the middle of the table. "I believe this belongs to you, Mrs. Miller. A souvenir from a planning session, perhaps." Isabella's face went white as a sheet. She looked at Robert, her eyes wide with panic. "Robert, this is insane. Your mother is a senile old witch. She's making all of this up." But Robert wasn't looking at her. He was staring at the paperwork, at the undeniable proof of her betrayal. He looked at the name Julian Croft, then at the picture of the seashell, and a terrible, dawning comprehension washed over his face. He looked like a man who had been stabbed. "Isabella, who is Julian Croft?" he whispered, his voice cracking. "He's nobody. He's a business contact," she shrieked. "A business contact to whom you've wired over $200,000 of my money?" he asked, his voice rising with anguish and disbelief. "The money from my house? From my future? It was an investment." "The clause has been triggered," Mr. Henderson interrupted, his voice cutting through the chaos. "As of 9 a.m. this morning, the deed to Margaret's home was transferred into the irrevocable trust. I am the trustee, and as trustee, I am now serving you both with this." He slid 2 final envelopes across the table. "That is a formal notice of eviction. You have 30 days to vacate the premises. If you are not gone by that time, the sheriff's department will be there to escort you out." Isabella finally broke. She stood up so fast, her chair screeched backward. "You can't do this! I'll sue you! I'll sue this whole family for everything you have." "You have nothing to sue for, Miss Garcia," Mr. Henderson said, using her maiden name with chilling intent. "The money you received was a gift, not an investment, as there was no formal contract. What you did with it afterwards, however. Wire fraud is a very serious federal offense, especially when it involves offshore accounts. I would think very carefully about your next move. I suspect Mr. Croft has already disappeared, and you, my dear, are the one left holding the empty bag." She looked at Robert, her face a mask of desperation. "Robert, honey, don't let them do this to us. It's all a misunderstanding." But Robert had finally seen the truth. The polished brass had been struck, and the sound it made was ugly and false. He looked at her as if she were a stranger, his face a ruin of heartbreak and fury. "Get away from me," he choked out. The 30 days that followed were the quietest, most tense days of my life. Isabella locked herself in the guest room, emerging only at night. I could hear her on the phone, sometimes crying, sometimes screaming. Robert slept on the couch in the basement, next to his father's armchair. He barely spoke. He looked like a ghost haunting the ruins of his own life. The karma, when it came, was swift and brutal. The luxury SUV was repossessed from the driveway in the middle of the afternoon. Isabella's credit cards were declined. She tried to sell some of her designer clothes and bags online, only to discover they were worth a fraction of what she paid. Elysian Aura vanished without a trace, its social media pages deleted. The $500,000 was gone, vaporized into a puff of expensive perfume and champagne bubbles. On the final day, a small, battered U-Haul truck pulled up. Robert and a friend of his loaded up their boxes. It didn't take long. Most of what they owned was the cheap, stylish furniture Isabella had bought to replace mine. Robert moved like a robot, his face blank. Isabella came down the stairs, carrying one last suitcase. She didn't look at me. Her face was hard, stripped of all its charm, leaving only a bitter resentment. "I hope you're happy," she spat at me, "sitting all alone in your big, empty house." "My house is not empty," I said, my voice clear and steady. "It's full of love and memories. Something you wouldn't understand." She scoffed and walked out the door, slamming it behind her. Robert stood on the porch for a moment, his back to me. "Mum," he said, his voice thick with shame. "I am so sorry." "I know, Robert," I said softly. "Go. Figure out who you are without her." He nodded, not turning around, and walked to the truck. I watched them drive away until they were just a speck down the road. I heard later that they divorced. Isabella moved out of state, and I never heard from her again. Robert rented a small room in a boarding house across town and got a job at a lumber yard, doing hard physical labor, starting over from zero. He called me a month later, and the month after that. The calls were stilted at first, full of long, awkward silences. But he kept calling. He started coming over for dinner on Sundays. We didn't talk about what happened. Not yet. I just made him shepherd's pie, and he ate it. Last week, he helped me move his father's leather armchair from the basement back to its rightful place by the fireplace. He ran his hand over the worn leather, his eyes full of a sadness so profound it made my own heart ache. "Dad knew, didn't he?" he asked quietly. "He knew what she was from the very beginning." "Your father was a good judge of character," I said, "and he loved you very much. He just wanted to make sure his fortress was safe." Robert finally looked at me, and for the first time in a long time, I saw my son again, not Isabella's shadow. "I'm sorry I let the enemy in, Mum." "We all make mistakes, Robert," I told him, patting his hand. "The important thing is that we live to fight another day." My life is quiet again. The house smells like lemon polish and baking bread, not kale and expensive perfume. Sometimes I sit in the living room and look at Arthur's empty chair and I talk to him. I tell him about my day, about the garden, about Robert. I thank him. I thank him for his love, his wisdom, and for building a fortress strong enough to withstand any storm. He gave me the weapon I needed to save our family, to save our son. It turns out the most dramatic revenge isn't loud and fiery. Sometimes it's the quiet, patient, unshakable power of a love that reaches beyond the grave.